Well, good morning, New South Wales. Oh, come on, dudes, welcome me here. Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First and foremost, man, before I get started, my wife Claudia and I have really got to say thank you. The reception we have received, this is our first time in Australia. And I got to be honest, man, this is a world-class city. I mean, I know I'm not telling you anything, but our eyes are wide open. We have been treated like family. We have had an exceptional time, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all individually this evening, where I'll be joined by my great friend Ronnie from Oz Harvest, who I'll bring up a little bit as we get going. Now, before I do start this conversation, I just want to let you all know that I would not begrudge anybody who looked at my bio in the brochure accompanying all the information about the event and thinking, oh man, they've got this guy, he's going to come over from the United States and he's going to talk all about what a good dude, you know, what an angel he is, he feeds the poor. Dudes, I'm a reluctant, I'm a sinner. Just so you know, I try hard, but if anybody had seen us on Friday night on our welcoming dinner here drinking wine, you would know that I am not anything more than just a regular citizen trying to do something good for my town, just like you. And in fact, there are many things in common. In fact, it's funny, I was looking at all the people in the back row because that's where I sat during my entire career in school. I did not go to university. I barely graduated from school because at a young age, I wanted to open a nightclub. That's all I wanted to do since I was a very, very young man. In fact, my father was a military pilot back in the Vietnam era. And I was his first son. And in fact, it was me and then 4 sisters before he had another son. So you can imagine my father's chagrin when his first son at age 13 announced that he had lost all interest in school and all he wanted to do was open the greatest nightclub in the world. And that's what I did. I ran nightclubs. I ran punk rock nightclubs all the way to jazz nightclubs, which kind of is a great way to start our conversation because whether it's in the nightclub business, whether it's in the social enterprise world, and frankly, just about any business, there are 3 kinds of leaders. There's the first kind, which pretty much just has their head down. I can't look up. Man, I have to make payroll. I have to do what I have to do to keep the lights turned on. Don't talk to me about the future. Don't talk to me about trends. I just got to do what I got to do. The second looks up and to a certain extent sees the world changing and sees the future coming, but thinks, you know what, man, I got a lot to do. I'm just going to wait till the future comes to me. And the third kind of leader, and I know there's many in the room here, are the kind of leaders who say, I see the future, and I want to be part of making that future happen. I'm going to march out today to do something today to be part of that future. I want to introduce and welcome, and to a certain extent, profit off that future. So again, whether it's my earliest years running nightclubs, I always had to have my ear to the ground. I always had to know what was the next sound, what was the next kind of, what was the music, what was the lighting, what was the sound system, all the things that would have given me a competitive edge. And to a certain extent, made me feel almost more inspired as a restaurateur and nightclub person, because I wanted the best bands. I wanted the new sounds. I wanted people to be not just entertained, but really stimulated. I wanted people to leave with a genuinely new experience. So again, I was running nightclubs, and I did it pretty much since I was 17, all the way through my 20s. But it was the same time in the States, and I have to assume here too, that the men and women who were homeless, there were always been people on the fringe. But in Washington, D.C., where my wife and I had lived for many years, the number of people who were homeless became really just completely impossible to ignore. In fact, many of you all who have been to the States, it's not just Washington, it's not just L.A., it's so many cities. It's a very, very disturbing trend. And like many people, I had, to a certain extent, my nightclub vision was about using the power of music to get people to potentially hear things, to think things that they might have been afraid to. Now, when I was a young man, just like today, just like here in Australia, back in the States, America was very divided. My parents and their friends argued about politics, but if my father would put on a Motown record at any one of the many parties he had, I might add, all their friends danced to that music. And I became fascinated as a young man because the language of that music spoke to some of the issues of the day that they were afraid of, they didn't want to hear about. Yet when it was put to lyrics, when they could dance to it, somehow they heard it. So as a young man, for me, owning a nightclub wasn't necessarily just about selling alcohol, putting on bands, making profit, employing people. It was that sense of what you could do through the subtlety of your show, right? So I was very fascinated in that, and I was always listening to new things, but like I said, I would walk to work every day and I'd see more and more homeless people. And like most people, I always say, hello, my name is Robert and I'm a recovering hypocrite, because I talk so much about changing the world with music. Yet I'd walk to work every day and I'd see homeless people lining up on the street. And I would make eye contact. I wasn't uncaring, but I was definitely kept a distance. There was a sense of fear, to be quite honest with you. So I'd walk to work every day thinking, I wish somebody would do something about this. A, it's not good for business, but B, these are human beings on the street. There's got to be something happening. But again, I just went about this daily routine, of saying it's somebody else's job. Somebody else should do something about this. And then one night, some friends of mine asked, would you like to go out with us and serve men and women who were homeless on the street? And I'll be honest with you, I did not particularly want to go, but they were insistent. So I thought, look, this is one night, just go, just do this, just get it out of your way. You'll get some brownie points in heaven, life will be good, you'll go back to working in nightclubs. But we went out there and two things happened. My nervousness, and I was nervous because I had never really been close to someone who was homeless, So there was a great sense of, what am I getting myself into? What will this actually be like? It's one thing to imagine it. It's another thing to be bouncing on a truck, going down the center of Washington, D.C. with a big pot of lentil soup and bags of breads and bananas and everything, going out to start to serve people. So again, like many people, I was just kind of chattering away to mask my nervousness and asked innocently enough, where does the food come from? And, I was told it was purchased, and actually it was purchased at one of the most expensive grocery stores in Washington, D.C. And I was just thinking to myself, I work in an industry, we throw away food every night. And not just I worked in nightclubs, and just so you know, in the States, you have to sell 51% of your income has to be based on food. So, you can sell alcohol, but you still have to sell food. So I knew how much food we throw away. Well, like any good manager of a nightclub, particularly one who aspired to be, to put on big shows out front, shows and revenue are based on what you do out back. So I knew what our inventory was, and I knew what our waste level was, and I knew we threw away food. But not only that, but a lot of my friends back in the 1980s had left the world of nightclubs and restaurants where, to be quite honest, you had to work really hard for your tips. To make $100 at a bar, you ran hard all night long. Pouring drinks, breaking up fights, trying to keep everything in order. But the point is, a lot of them had left to do catering, where you could make pretty good money walking around with a silver tray. You could make literally the same amount of money, and they were lamenting the fact that late at night, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, after the party broke up, whatever food was left over was thrown away. Now again, from a business perspective, from a caterer's point of view, the fridge back at the shop is full of tomorrow's money. That's out the door now, it's gone. Somebody paid for it, it's out here, don't bring it back. So they were lamenting the fact that, again, late at night, night after night, they were throwing away food. So I'm thinking to myself, wow, they're buying food. This entire town is full of food being wasted, But I didn't really think much about it, because we pulled up, and they are outside, right down smack dab in the middle of Washington, with the Washington Monument in the background, frankly, right across the street from the State Department. Outside in the rain was this long line of people sitting there like this, waiting for this truck to pull up, as it did night after night, full of volunteers just like me. And it was literally like this. We were, to a certain extent, high up in this truck serving people down below us here, right? And a few things happened. A, wasn't as bad as I thought. People were really, we had conversations. People were genuinely grateful, so there's a great sense of this is okay, But I kept thinking, person after person I met was lucid, respectful, to a certain extent, very conversational. So I kept thinking, I thought everyone who I'd meet would be really kind of, for lack of a better word, mentally impaired, right? So here I was being really stumped by the reality of who I was talking to. But at the other end of the line, we had a line of people in this truck, each one doing our different duty. But at the end of the line was the driver of the truck, who was kind of the one constant every night. He was the person driving the truck. And he was sitting at the end of the line watching us and making sure we're doing it right. But he was talking to everybody who was the last person, and he knew everybody by name. And he virtually said, see you tomorrow night, see you tomorrow night, see you tomorrow night. And I'm just trying to mind my own business, get through the night. But I couldn't help but hear this. See you tomorrow night, see you tomorrow night. I'm looking at it's raining, and I'm thinking, I work in an industry, it throws away food every night, but it also has jobs. I wonder, so on the way home, my wife Claudia and I were driving, and I just asked her to write some notes down for what became a very small business plan that was based to a certain extent on Federal Express, which was a very new business at the time. And it had revolutionized the industry of package delivery because it used a central hub model, Memphis, Tennessee. And I thought, wow, what would it be like if we could create a central hub in this picture here? The idea of the LA kitchen at the center, but the idea of a central kitchen where restaurants, hotels, hospitals, universities, farmers, people who hate to throw away food, they just don't want to be sued for getting someone sick, right? So if you could find a way to safely, professionally, reliably pick that food up, who wouldn't want this, right? But more importantly, I proposed a cooking school, saying, look, I respect and appreciate the historic nature of what I did that night. I understood this was a very traditional model in which volunteers who meant well, took food that they labored over outside to feed men and women who were on the streets. I understand its history. But to a certain extent, as someone like you all who's dedicated to seeing the future and trying to be open and inclusive, I kept thinking, look, instead of seeing men and women just as mere recipients of charity, maybe they could be part of the solution, not just recipients, but participants. So the idea of a cooking school, the idea that you could chop, dice, puree, all these different things you got and produce beautiful, healthy meals, but men and women could learn a job. And in effect, you could shorten the line by the way you served it and then repay the restaurants who donated the food with entry-level people. Everybody would benefit. Now, I was quite proud of myself for this little novelty idea that I cooked up. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to go back, and I arranged to meet with some of the different groups that volunteered to go on the truck and said, look, I'm a volunteer, but I went out one night and I looked at your system here, and, I'm a restaurant person. I understand the process we're going through. I'd like to suggest an idea for you all to consider. And I laid out my plan for what became the DC Central Kitchen, and I sat back after my presentation and waited for the wave of applause to wash over me, and I kind of assumed there would be a Volunteer of the Year award somewhere in the back for me, eventually. But I was astonished by how resistant to change the people who ran these charities were. There was a sense of, we know you mean well, but. And I listened, and like any businessman, like any entrepreneur, I had anticipated certain questions that they might have. Anybody who presents a business plan is going to be prepared to a certain extent for the questions that arise when you propose a no system. So for example, people said, it's illegal for restaurants and hotels to donate food. The health department won't let you. And it's like, now that's an urban myth, and I know that exists, but it's not necessarily true. In fact, there is no law. So again, we went through a couple of questions, but then it became really apparent that what people were doing were actually really clutching for anything they could to shoot down my idea. People said restaurants won't do this, and it's like, look, restaurant people, you got to understand, restaurant people hate throwing away food. That's money. And nobody comes along and hauls away that trash for free. They got to pay for that. And they got to pay for pest control. And whenever they want to hire somebody, they have to put an ad in the paper and go through a long list of applicants that they don't really know anything about. And they're, for all intents and purposes, rolling the dice for those employees. Who's going to be a good waiter, a good bartender, a good manager for me? So there was a sense of, I don't think you all understand that this is perfect for the restaurant industry. I actually had letters from 25 restaurateurs who said we would welcome this relationship. But then people started saying, no, you're naive to think that restaurants will hire men and women home from prison, men and women who've been addicts. And I don't know how it is here, but I got to tell you, that's who runs restaurants in America. I mean, the restaurant industry has always been an island of misfit toys. That's where everybody who doesn't fit in goes to work. And that's the joy of our industry, man. Restaurants, really all their, I don't know, any business, any restaurant, any bar that doesn't want just one thing, show up on time. Just show up on time, and the rest will figure it out. But that idea, that sense that I was trying to help an industry that was so resistant. There was a sense of, this is the way it is, this is the way it was, this is the way it will always be, that really shocked me. Because again, I just thought I was going to help and then go back to running nightclubs, but it became very, very apparent very quickly that nobody was going to even remotely consider this idea. So naively, I thought, well, man, I'll get this thing started. They don't understand food service. I get it. I'll get it started. get it going, and then I'll go back to running nightclubs. But here we are 30 years later, and this has become my nightclub. But I have consistently, and will always consistently seek to continue to push those boundaries. Now, to be quite honest with you, brothers and sisters, I came into this industry with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because I was born to open the greatest nightclub in the world. But the fact that I had to defer my dream to do something that an industry should have welcomed with open arms, an idea that they could get less people, that by their daily work, fewer people would be on the streets tomorrow than there were today. I was shocked and frankly appalled at the resistance to change that would enable that system to be maintained. So I came in, to a certain extent, loaded for proverbial bear, wanting to really challenge this system. How could you behave this way? But more importantly, what I love to suggest oftentimes is nobody wakes up when they're 21 and looks in the mirror and says, when I get older, I'm going to be a boring bureaucrat that stifles innovation. Nobody does that. Yet too often the world is full of people, and I wondered, how could people who had to have been fiery young leaders who were going to change the world, how did these men and women become men and women who looked at me and said to a person just trying to help, thank you, but no thank you, we have it, go away. And so the idea was, how could I not only build a system that would actually deliver on the promises I was making, but how could I avoid falling into that trap that so many seemingly easily had fallen into? So every day of those 30 days, I have practiced a thing I call relentless incrementalism. This idea of sometimes we get lost thinking it's got to be big. It's got to make spectacular strides, versus that idea of every day relentlessly pursuing better, faster, stronger. How can I liberate more people, serve better meals? How can I do it better, better, better? And that led me in 1996 to this idea of maybe the time has come for us to launch our own businesses. We encountered a point where for the first few years, I worked primarily with men and women who were heroin or alcoholics, addicts. And once men and women got cleaned up and could maintain that level of sobriety or clean lifestyle, it was relatively easy to get them a job. But then came a wave of men and women, and to a certain extent, I've always anticipated who's next in America to be poor, who's going to be needing food, who's going to be out on the street, and instead of waiting for that, how can I be part of stopping that in the first place? And I became aware that men and women were starting to return home from incarceration. We had a significant incarceration that we still do, sadly, in the United States, and there was going to be a predictable time in which a significant number of men and women were going to be coming home who were going to face difficulties to employment. In fact, we saw that firsthand because I would watch men and women who would work so hard. They had truly dedicated themselves to a different lifestyle. But this was also the advent of the computer age, in which men and women would apply for a job online. And in the States, if you checked that box that said, have you had a felony conviction? If you checked that box, pretty much every computer system would kick out your application. So imagine watching people who truly wanted a gig. They loved what they were doing. And our entire model was built around that sense of how do you help somebody see themselves differently. So the model is very simple. Food that was donated, as I suggested earlier, restaurants, hotels, hospitals, caterers would come to the central kitchen where men and women over a 14-week period would learn a wide variety but very focused curriculum in which they would become certified food handlers. They would have a great sense of food science, to understand so that everybody on our team, because we're dealing with donated food, has to be very aware of food safety. But a very interesting moment happened early on because we had a group of lawyers come. We've always been a magnet for media. And to a certain extent, in fact, we opened up on George Bush Sr.'s inauguration day. The first donor of food to the DC Central Kitchen was the President of the United States. Because I knew that they were going to have these giant, enormous inaugural parties and there would be food left over. So with a young man's naivete, I just kept calling up, trying to find who was in charge of catering for the inauguration. And I finally ended up with that phone call where somebody said, yes, can I help you? It's like, well, I'm looking for the caterer for the dinner. That's me. What do you need? It's like, I have a new program, the DC Central Kitchen. I have refrigerated trucks. I'd love to come and pick up the food from the inauguration. It's going to be great business for you because it will put the administration in the light of a group that doesn't want to see food wasted and wants to help a program that gets men and women back on the street and makes them tax-paying citizens. And I didn't even get that out before they said it's a great deal, let's do it. And every media outlet in the world, who can resist images of the President of the United States and the parties around that inauguration going to men and women the next day? So we launched with that sense, and that attracted a lot of men and women who wanted to volunteer and be part, certainly chefs and restaurateurs to be sure, but everyday people who wanted to volunteer. And we had a group of lawyers come in once, and I remember there was a gentleman who had been a heroin addict for almost 25 years of his life. And he was, to a certain extent, running the kitchen that day, and I asked him to get these volunteers situated and producing, right? And I left, but as I left, I remember looking and seeing everyone kind of frozen, looking at each other. And I realized that for John, the volunteer, the student, these doctors were like gods on earth. They represented almost his own sense of inferiority. Who am I next to these men and women? These are professionals, these are physicians. And it almost, you could see him shrinking back into that sense of I'm a nobody, I'm a failure. And yet at the same time, I was looking at the doctors who were clearly looking at each other and like sitting there like there's a homeless guy with a knife here. And there was a sense of like, who's going to make the first move? But both sides were frozen in front of each other, both frozen, as I was that first night, by their stereotype of the other. And so I was racing to get back, thinking, this isn't going to work. But I came back, and there was John surrounded by these doctors teaching them to julienne cut a carrot. And that changed my entire approach, because it's like, oh my goodness, one of the biggest barriers. And so often in our business, we're always thinking about how do we bring people in? How do we help remove barriers that would keep people from coming into our establishments or participating? And suddenly it became obvious to me, wow, why don't we do away with the false barrier that most people expect? I'm going to a charity to serve the poor. I'm going to take food, and there'll be a table, and I will serve people this way. And our model became bring everybody around to the same side of the table. So that again, whether you were a university student who wanted to get service hours, an older person who wanted to stay active and productive. And what we had many times from our location in Washington, D.C., presidents, Bill Clinton and his family, the Obamas would come quite often. And again, imagine the power of someone who had been in prison 10 or 20 years. And through this fluke, they suddenly are in a place where not only are they trying to build themselves up, but suddenly they're standing next to the President of the United States. And that idea when suddenly, the president can look over and say, am I doing this right? And the power of food is when somebody in that position, again, a felon, an addict, can turn over and say, actually, no, you're not. You do it this way. That's the power of food, that idea that we're citizens of the same city. And the only way we are going to move past the kind of status quo of charity and business, .com, .org, is this idea if we see it as a combined effort, we have to approach it as we're shared citizens of the same city. And that has been a big standard for everything we've done. And that idea of trying to be leadership, you in Sydney here, or you in New South Wales, the opportunity you have to influence people who come in to your businesses, or the media you might attract, to get them to see through your work, which is good business for you, things they aren't used to seeing. And again, that power through the media, because when the President of the United States comes to your organization, the media of the world is there. And you have a choice. You can absorb it all and hope people love you and give you money, versus saying, how can I help other people see what we're doing here through this magic moment where we have the President of the United States? So again, for us, it was this notion of no waste. Everybody has a role. Everybody has something to contribute. A great nonprofit doesn't try and fix the problem. These problems are too big for an organization to fix. A great nonprofit reveals the power of community to solve issues when they work together. And that has been my dedicated life. But as I alluded to earlier, I'm focused on what comes next. I want to be, just as I did as a young man, always wanted to hear the next sound. And by the way, before we go any further, can I thank you, Australia, for the great gift of AC/DC. Before we go any further, I mean, come on, Malcolm and Angus, and God bless Bon Scott. That's another discussion. But I mean, again, just whether it's the Saints, whether it's Midnight Oil, there's just so many great bands from this country. And I don't know anybody, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but there's a great band called the Goons of Doom. I don't know if you've heard of them. I still love music, but it was just, they're a great band. They were playing last night in about 500 miles north, and I looked at my watch and thought, oh no, I really can't do it. But I was tempted for a moment to, go there. But anyway, I'm always thinking about the future, and two things have really become fascinating for me. It's supply and demand. At the end of the day, and this is really important, every day in America, at least, we waste probably about 40% of the food we produce. Staggering amount. But half of that is cosmetically imperfect fruits and vegetables. And this was a big part of our business model. The idea of we wanted to start jobs, we wanted to create jobs for men and women who couldn't seem to break through their past. They couldn't shake that conviction record they had. So the idea was, I can see how dedicated these men and women are. Why don't we start a business? Why don't we break that mold of what we did? When we broke the mold, the idea was, okay, well, now I've started this kitchen, and I can train people for a job. And we were experiencing, as we still do in the States, a significant increase in service jobs. So there was plenty of work. But the traditional model was we would do the job training and then send men and women out, and they'd find jobs in the industry. And we had visiting chefs come in all the time to train men and women. At the same time, those visiting chefs could help men and women see in themselves a future, because what we were able to find is that many of those chefs that we work with had struggled with addiction, didn't do well in high school like I did, didn't have higher education. Some even had brushes with the law. So that fact that they could say, I own my own restaurant now, but I'm not that different. I've been clean and sober for 5 years. How about you? And suddenly it was addict to addict. And there was this great sense of, and for a lot of the men and women, that sense of I can do it. But again, we started two things. We started buying food from local farmers. The idea was, well, we can wait a week till this stuff is getting to the point where they're just going to donate it to charity. Or we can come out early and say, why don't we buy it from you at a reduced price because it's imperfect. But the point is that would allow us to take the money we saved on food costs and reinvest it into wages for our graduates. So we started our own business, and we, again, surfed the trends of the day. During that time, there was an incredible desire for young married couples to have green weddings. And I don't know how many times we ended up in the wedding business because people really wanted the idea. I mean, again, think about it. I can't imagine bride's mother saying, what, you're going to hire felons for your wedding? But it worked, and everybody wanted it. But this also idea of not only were we training people, but we were supporting local farmers. That duality, that we were supporting local agriculture while keeping people out of jail, and that all the money we made went back to the job training program, which started the whole thing over again. And again, those men and women, while they were in training, they were doing 7,000 meals a day, which were going out to nonprofit partners and saving them money. So again, the system involved food that would have been thrown away, people our society undervalued, chefs who had jobs and would help teach, agencies that were really looking for better food than they were getting elsewhere, men and women who wanted off the street. All those things were there. The power of what I bring, and do not think for 1 minute I'm here to sell me. I'm here to talk to you about the resources you have, because everything I have, you have too. I'm not needed in this equation. All I'm saying is most communities are rich, but so often we're so used to seeing things one way. Well, this food's left over, we just throw it away. That person's been in prison, they have no value. I'm a chef, I need jobs, here's where I'll go to get them. We just said, in fact, let's rearrange everything. But again, that constant sense of motion, but this is what really led me to Los Angeles and my new job that I'm really quite excited about. Now, I'm an older man now, and I had spent almost 25 years leading an organization that had become, to a certain extent, a really well-known organization, not only in Washington, D.C., but all around the United States and, to a certain extent, globally. We had helped about 60 cities open kitchens like ours. And again, I'm open source, which means anything I have, I share. We had also developed a program called Campus Kitchens, realizing there were 60,000 school cafeterias in America that were closed all afternoon, all night, and all weekend. And like here, young men and women in school have to do service to graduate high school. And again, think about the old model was, well, students leave school and come volunteer at the charity. And I looked particularly at universities and thought, there's universities all around America that are full with an entire freshman class who've been raised doing service. Why on earth should I not look at their facility? It's closed all afternoon, and maybe we can make an arrangement. Now there's 70 campus kitchens down there. And this is really important because while it's tempting sometimes to look at the opportunities that might be present in a town like Sydney, with all its riches, all its resources, what really interests me isn't like Los Angeles and Sydney. It's a town 30 miles, 60 miles, 100 miles out. It's those rural communities where oftentimes the young men and women are leaving to find work in the city, leaving an older population, and often politicians trying to figure out, how do I make this economy work? Everything's gone haywire. There's no more factories, so there's no more jobs. So the idea of that school cafeteria being a processing plant for local agriculture. Now, speaking of which, on Friday in The Guardian, there was an interesting report that talked about Australia and the fact that the tomato industry here throws away almost 80% of all tomatoes grown in Australia is thrown away. 80%. That's a staggering number. And imagine the business opportunity for not only those farmers who are desperate for an alternative than just plowing under these crops that they oftentimes work really hard. And the reason, just like in the States, is they aren't perfect. Too many grocery stores, driven by very much by us. If that's for me, I'm not here. I'm busy right now. But this idea of it's too perfect, it's not perfect enough. So the idea of all those tomatoes, to me, that's money being thrown away, literally. But it's an opportunity to make money. Again, imagine here in Australia, if any group, any club could say, look, we've got a kitchen, we've got chefs, we've got jobs. You know, what happens if we can help train people and take some of those tomatoes and not only make things out of it that might go to our charitable partners, but potentially maybe we could do a social enterprise too. The reason I went to Los Angeles, two things happened. As I suggested earlier, that era in which restaurants throw away food, those chefs that you saw earlier, brilliant chefs I might add, every day all around the world, cooking schools are graduating students who are coming into restaurants with better inventory controls. To a certain extent, the industry that I was part of 25 years ago has shifted so dramatically that I too must shift, because I can't go to a restaurateur anymore or a hotel person and assume that they can have leftover food. All leftover food is lost profit. And no matter where you go in this changing global economy, a chef's job now is to reduce waste. So I had to think, where can I find a reliable source of food for the future? And that's when I really set on the idea of fruits and vegetables that are cosmetically imperfect. And not unlike Sydney, Los Angeles is one of those perfect growing environments. So I have access to an incredible amount of fruits and vegetables year-round, some of the best products and the most nutritious product anywhere in the world. But more importantly, and germane to everyone in the world, but particularly places like Sydney and Los Angeles, every single day in the United States, 10,000 people turn 70 years old. Every single morning. You know, and that is a profound global phenomenon. Never in the history of the world have this many people lived this long. And I went to do a speech a decade ago for Meals on Wheels, probably similar to what you have here, in which men and women deliver meals, homebound meals, to older people who are homebound, right? And I was talking to the president before I went on, and she said to me, you know, we've got a waiting list in half of our cities for Meals on Wheels. And that just really shook me, because again, this was probably 2003, 2004, and I knew that the first of the 80 million baby boomers, my generation, people born between 1946 and 1963, that the first one wasn't going to turn 60 until 2006. So it's like, wait, you got a waiting list now, and there's 80 million people coming? And that's when I started to really think, because too often, in too many places, there's many people that it becomes easier and easier to overlook, but sadly, and I think this is true, and I don't want to speak out of my experience because I haven't lived here, but I'm going to hazard a guess that not unlike the United States, older people tend to vanish. You know, they're pushed out. They're ignored. To a certain extent, there's a sense of they're all off retired somewhere. And we have focused, understandably, for many, many decades on the idea of children who are hungry. We've done that at the expense sometimes of elders who are hungry. And it isn't because I heart old people. It's just this is the future, whether I like it or not, and I must march out to meet this future. I cannot sit by, just as I hope some of you will feel after this conversation, and sit and wait, knowing that tens of thousands of older people will go hungry because they don't have enough money in the bank for the extra years science will give them. And not unlike that wasted food, not unlike our country, in your country too, this generation represents the richest, freest, most educated generation in the history of the world, the deepest well of life experience anywhere, anytime. Shame on us if we don't see this potential resource in every single community. Now, of course, from an economic perspective, we've got to keep this generation active and living independently and staying productive as long as possible. So this idea of saying, what happens if we go to Los Angeles, California? Now, I grew up in there as a young man. My father was in the military, and before you went to Vietnam, you were stationed in California. So I knew the environment. But I kept thinking, this is the perfect opportunity, because what most people don't realize, and it's very germane to what's going on in Hollywood right now with Harvey Weinstein, is to a certain extent, Los Angeles is home to the largest concentration of older people in America. Most people don't know that. Not unlike Sydney, again, there's this huge number of people, and I think it's 25% of the population here, and virtually every other city in Australia is soon to be over 65. But it's so overlooked because we're in a town that celebrates youth and the false notion of beauty. So that idea you could go to Los Angeles, California, the belly of the proverbial ageism beast, the place that promulgates this idea that if you aren't young, if your skin isn't perfect, you know, if you aren't blonde, if you don't wear a bikini, you aren't beautiful. This is the perfect moment, the perfect time to challenge that archaic idea. So to a certain extent, it sounds funny, but our motto is wrinkled food, wrinkled people, no waste, no waste. You know, everything has value. The simple notion, again, think about this when we have children come to volunteer. How powerful it is when they can see that a small wrinkle. If you can ask a child, if your mother sent you to the grocery store and said to buy an apple, which one would you bring home, right? Now, obviously, and understandably, everyone's going to go for that perfect one. But to help a child see that all it takes is a little flick of a knife. You know, and that flick of a knife can be something that gives a human a job, the training they need. But that is just one step from a child saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. And that powerful doorway for a generation of children to see that everything has value, to look past the superficial concept of beauty and see that everything has a role. Nobody is too far down that they can't climb back up, and nobody is too weak that they can't help another climb alongside them. That's our motto. But that idea that I could go to a city the size of Los Angeles and not just build a charity that might take donated food, train people, and this time, as you heard from Ann, and thank you, Ann, for that really lovely introduction. You know, that idea you could take a younger person aging out of foster care, and I hate to paint with a big brush, but statistically, oftentimes those men and women are on the road to the streets, to addiction, to prison. Could we match them with men and women who are coming home after 10 or 20 years? Now again, similarly to when I launched the DC Central Kitchen, everybody in this industry said you can't put those two groups together. Everyone thought, and again, I can understand it, but everybody thought, oh, those older prisoners, man, they're going to infect those young people. You know, and they're going to suddenly, it'll be like students learning from the master. You know, but what we found is the exact opposite, that reality is, for a younger person, that older person coming home, that person, that older man or woman can look and say, you know, you have your own life to live, but you look just like I did when I was your age. And I know how you feel, and I made a really stupid mistake, and I paid for it with 25 years of my life. I don't want to see you make that same mistake. Just like you might have a running buddy or a lifting buddy at the gym, that idea of an older or younger person, that intergenerational power of old and young learning with and from each other, that power for an older person to learn that they have a role to play, not just in the kitchen learning, but in that mentorship to a younger person to keep them on that road that keeps them out of that system. And conversely, can that young person help an older man and woman acclimate to a world that's sped up so fast to the point of teaching people about computers, let alone Facebook, Instagram, or a variety of other things? That powerful intergenerational mix is at the very heart of what we do. But I want to go back to that senior thing, because Los Angeles, California, like every city, has a large amount of contracts from the city to prepare meals for those seniors. So again, once again, that idea of saying, wow, I'm interested in the senior issue, maybe I can build this model that does both at the same time. So if a farmer calls and says, I want to donate 2 trucks of tomatoes, we can say, I'll tell you what, give us 1. And again, we'll use that to train people, engage volunteers, thousands of volunteers. And again, our students manage the volunteers. Again, that constant reinforcement. You might have learned how to cut up a tomato a week ago, but now you're going to teach somebody every single day. It's going to be that cascading knowledge. But that idea that we might be able to produce beautiful, healthy meals for older people. And I really want to get back to this, because for the longest time, and I say this with love in my heart, in the charitable world, we oftentimes just kind of push the food that was donated down onto poor people. And at least in the United States, you can make a case that there's a significant increase in diabetes and obesity amongst the poor because of the way we fed the poor through charity. So I became fixated on this idea of health, you know, and the idea that we could take and help people respectfully. I'm not here to be a nutritional imperialist and tell people how to eat. But understanding, for example, let's go back to the senior meal construct. This is business 101 for us in this business. The reality is we are a country sharing a meat culture. Many of us have meat 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But from the business standpoint, the idea that we can feed this many older people who are predictably going to come meat every day, economically it won't work. I mean, we can talk all day about sustainability and health and animal rights. I can do that all day long, but the point is just economics 101. You can't afford it. So a large part of what we're interested in is how can we actually look deep, just as the chefs were trying to redefine the menu you have. I too am trying to redefine a menu. What does a senior meal of the future look like? How do we use food in a way that doesn't just nourish but strengthens? In fact, we called our business Strong Food. So we have a for-profit company called Strong Food. And to a certain extent, it's just my fail-safe, because, you know, I always say, man, you know, we're trying to introduce millet, farro, quinoa, all kinds of things. And, you know what old people in LA and ancient Israelites have in common? Man, they hate farro. You know, that's my joke. I've been working on that. I tell you, one of these days I'm going to get that joke down right. Wasn't a bad laugh, but I could do better. But you get my point, man. I'm going to people who've been raised all their life, and I don't want to come along and say, here, you know, I'm taking away your beloved bacon, you know, and replacing it with tofu. You know, I got to meet people where they're at and begin a process. But this is something, I'm not preaching to you. I'm trying to suggest that we face the same dilemma, but the same opportunity. The future is coming. You know, to a certain extent, I as a charity also have to look at where's my money going to come from. We're a generation that was raised that we wrote a check to charity. You know, we worked hard, and we came up in a time in which you got a job and you kept that job. Brothers and sisters, the millennials are coming, and it's a very, very different world. They're not going to write a check to charity. For them, you know, where they go at night, the bar they go to, the menu they pick, that's their philanthropy. This is why a whole generation of chefs now are looking at that wasted food and realizing there's a whole generation of new customers come into your clubs that are going to insist on this idea of you not only waste food, but can you buy some of that imperfect produce and see it used. In fact, one of the most, you'll love this, speaking of beer, one of my great friends in the UK, when you're in my business, people always want to donate bread, you know, and people will say, oh, I've got the best bread in LA or Sydney. And I'm like, can't take it. And they're like, no, but it's the best bread. It's like, yep, it's bread today, it's a weapon tomorrow. You know, that baguette that looks so good today, one day from now, man, it is a stick that you can assault somebody with. And they'll say you can make it. It's like, I know, I can make croutons, I can make bread pudding. I can't take it. I can't take it. I respect you, I just can't take it. A friend of mine from the UK called up. And again, I am good at what I do. And for 30 years, I've been plumbing the depths of opportunity I could squeeze out of every ounce of food I get. But he called up and says, you know that bread we always hate? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I got a new idea. It's like, what? And he's like, beer. And I'm like, what? And he's like, yeast. So he launched a new beer line called Toast that's made, I know, brilliant, right? Brilliant, you know? I love a good shtick. But that idea, imagine that idea of for a younger generation, the beer I drink is fighting food waste. That's what's coming. You know, I mentioned getting older too, this generation, and I know many of your customers are older, but you know one of the things I'm fascinated by the most? Man, you know, I love probability. You know, when you can say, you know, put a few things together and kind of anticipate the future. Women outlive men, women outnumber men. Brothers and sisters, the future is women, you know? And the reality is, what does an older woman customer want besides all the Chardonnay she can drink? But, that one's a good, I got that one across. But you get my point. The world is changing, whether it's a younger generation who has thousands of new ideas about what food looks like, how you should run your business, and they're going to be wild about it, to the point where, you know, as we all know, the idea that somebody can come in and take their iPhone and say, here's a picture of my meal, and it can be, this was the best meal I've ever had, you should come, versus look at the waste they throw away. You know, literally, there are so many different ways in which this generation is going to change us. So the opportunity you have is you can be part of the change and leaders of this movement, or you can wait and bide your time and be forced to a certain extent by the realities of a new business world. What I just like to suggest is there's tremendous opportunities, and at the very heart will probably be what you're going to hear in the next keynote speaker, which is government, because there isn't a mayor anywhere in the world that doesn't have one thing in mind. How can I keep the money local? How can I make sure that every dime spent in Sydney stays in Sydney? Now I go back to city contracts. You know, when I first came to Los Angeles, there was concern that, for example, I was having to compete with big multinational caterers for these contract opportunities. And I'm happy to compete on a peer-to-peer basis based on the quality of our product, but the reality is in too many cities, low bid always wins the contract. You know, and low bid is where bad food, low wages, and oftentimes exported profit lives. So I worked with our city officials, and we introduced legislation that actually gave priority to social enterprise businesses. In social enterprises, there's many different definitions, but the reality is Sydney, by the way, in Australia is a leader in social enterprise. But what you're looking for is mayors who show up on day one saying, I love the power of social enterprise. Again, you're taking food that would have been thrown away. You're training people for jobs. You're creating good paying jobs. You're applying for contracts to make sure our elders are fed a better, healthier meal. You're providing volunteer activities for them. By the way, I got to stop for a second. See that picture that's up there right now? I went to Catholic school as a kid. If I could go back, if somebody from the past came, if somebody from the future came back when I was 8 years old and said, hey, someday you're going to be best friends with a nun, I would never have believed them. That nun right there, Sister Alice, when I came to LA, this is the power of our industry. Because again, while you might think I'm a charity, we are all in service. I love service. In fact, yesterday we were at the beach on the long walk, right? And I stopped by a little cafe to get a bite to eat. And when we were done, I picked up our empty dishes and took them over to the counter. They're like, oh, you don't have to do that. And it's like, once in service, always in service. You know, that's just the way we are. But when I arrived in Los Angeles, Sister Alice there ran Meals on Wheels. And here I was coming in talking about, man, I'm going to revolutionize senior meals. And the reality is, Sister Alice could have looked at me and said, hey, man, who invited you? This is my town. And don't think nuns aren't like that, you know. But the reality is, she could have seen me as an enemy, as an interloper, as competition. You know, but the reality is, she called up and said, welcome. You know, while you're getting set up, would you like to share our kitchen and get your job training program started? And the first 3 classes were held in her kitchen. That's the power of not seeing change as the enemy, not seeing competition as the enemy, but realizing we have a powerful opportunity to make every city in New South Wales, in Los Angeles, around the world more powerful if we stand side by side and work together. And again, I like good, healthy competition. But ever since that moment when I met Sister Alice, there's a sentence, and God bless her, she just passed a couple of months ago. And to a certain extent, I see my future as keeping her legacy alive. You know, this idea that this woman invited me in, just as you all have here. You have welcomed me with open arms, and I am internally grateful for this rare opportunity to come to a group of people that I have a great affinity with. Again, as I've alluded to many times, you know, when I first started this business, people thought, man, who's this nightclub guy? You know, he's part of the problem, man. He's the person selling people liquor all night long. He's the guy who runs these nightclubs where there's drugs everywhere, you know? I was seen as somebody who was part of the problem, but the reality is what I tried to offer and what I still do every single day, and what I'm aligned with you are, is the resources we have open the door to a powerful new system, a powerful new opportunity, a powerful new way to see our cities and the community that we bred. At the end of the day, what I do isn't provide meals. And what the food movement about in this country and around the world isn't about food. It's about community. It's what have made the club systems in New South Wales so powerful. It's because what you represent isn't a club necessarily, it's a community. It's where people come together to find common ground, to talk about their past, to share great joys of a night out together or a day together, but also to think about the future and the powerful opportunity we have if we work side by side, day in and day out, making money, doing good, loving our community, loving our country, and making the world a better place every day at a time. Thank you very, very much.
Wow, what about that address? Please join me in thanking Robert Egger. That was really inspirational.
Thank you very much.
Guys, we've got a couple of minutes before morning tea. Have we got some questions or some comments or anything that people would like to ask of Robert while we have him here in this beautiful city? We've got some roving mics. Where are the mics? Great. Let's see if we've got a question or two.
By the way, I love being the person standing between you and refreshments. I apologize. I'll be brief. Whatever you ask, I promise.
There's one down here, Marita, actually. Or is it... Have you got one too, Tyne? Okay, let's go to Tyne's first, and then Marita will come down here to the front.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question about over here.
Oh, thank you. Oh, okay.
Considering the employees and volunteers you take on, do you ever find a case where you have maybe recidivism, if that's the word? You find some of the people you take on, they can't help but go back, and I'm thinking of things like theft within your organisation. How do you deal with that if that happens?
Well, you know, this is not specific to you know, in our industry, there's always the issues we're talking about, whether it's theft, you know, there's a million things, but it isn't polka dots and moonbeams. You know, it's people come, people go. We work hard. We have an entire social work team. And what's interesting too is we've invited in a lot of university students who are now learning social work, physical therapy, gerontology. In fact, interesting enough, we actually have students, second-year medical students, who come to the LA Kitchen to learn culinary medicine. There's a generation of younger doctors who are desperate to learn preventative care through food, right? So there's this combination, but particularly the social workers. So we have an entire system. We work with judges and parole officers who, again, we oftentimes don't really think about how their life is. You know, imagine coming home, being a judge, and every day, how was your job today? It's like, I had to send some stupid kid to jail for 20 years for a stupid mistake. I mean, so we have judges who are really similarly they're really excited to have a partner as dedicated as we are. So again, it isn't a miracle program by any stretch, but a lot of the power is that for many students, they think this is going to be a school. And because they didn't do well in school, they're just watching their clock thinking, it's only a matter of time before I drop out and make it their fault. But so on the first day, what I've said to 120 classes now in my career is, today is your very first day, but there's somebody out on the street who's going to get a decent meal, and they might begin a journey that will end them here or back home. Because of your meal. There's an older person who isn't going to have to choose between medicine and food because of you. You know, there's a working mom who can focus on her job because there's an after-school program getting a snack today. You know, and to a certain extent, I think a lot of the students, that's the new high, is that sense of I'm needed, I have a role to play. You know, so there's a whole bunch of mechanisms we have. We'll bring in chefs, for example, you all know SpaceX, Elon Musk, who's landing, Tesla and all that stuff. The chef at his, where they produce all of their rocket ships is in Hawthorne in Los Angeles. Their chef will come over in the first week and say to the students, and really I'm aiming at the younger people, it's like, I'm going to Mars. I'm cooking for astronauts over at SpaceX. Who wants to work for me? If you want to work for me, you got to show up every single day at LA Kitchen, and I'll start you at $25 an hour with full benefits. And did I mention I'm going to Mars and you can come with me? So for a lot of young people, it's that sense of, that's the gig I want. So there's lots of ways we do it. And as I alluded to earlier, if anybody's interested, I am 100% open source and will gladly share anything I have or have developed with you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for that question. There's a question here. Yep. Go ahead.
Hi, Robert. John Tully. I'm fortunate to have been to your operation several times now. Can you explain a little bit about your board structure? There's a lot of directors in the room, and in particular, at the end of the day, you've got an incredible passion, an entrepreneurial spirit, but that has to be balanced. Also, at the end of the day, you're running a business. Can you explain a little bit to the group about your board and how they, I suppose, how they effectively manage you and that enthusiasm?
No, that's always, you know, there isn't an innovator in the room that sometimes doesn't have that friction with their board. You know, I'm an innovator. I want to charge forward, and plus I'm also inspired by this reality of this aging population coming and want to develop quickly new ideas, but I have to stop and bring the board along with me, and we work very closely together. But again, as I alluded earlier, I've always striven for a very, we have very transparent, but I want a very diverse board. You know, I want something that looks like the diversity of Los Angeles. And speaking of change, we're about to bring on 4 dynamic women to our board of directors, 2 of them under 30. Because I think it's important to really, as an older leader, it's my job to train the next generation of leaders. That's a responsibility I take very seriously. But at the same time, I want their youthful vigor. I'm 59 now. And as much as I'd like to think when I look in the mirror, I still got it. The reality is I need them to really, you know, help me reaffirm that, in effect, I either really do or I got to work a lot harder to keep up. But that point is I thrive on younger generation. But at the same time, the other person is the woman who took over from Sister Alice. This idea of let's align. Let's make sure that no one sees us as competing nonprofits, but we're aligned in the future of our city. But again, I think the power of a board is recognizing there's a new generation coming, and it's our job to not train them to think the way we did, but to be open up to learn from them and see how we can begin a journey that's important to take together.
Thank you, John.
And by the way, if you all haven't a chance, I'm not plugging John here, but John's been very, very gracious. He's come to the LA Kitchen 3 different times, and we're always the first stop after that flight over. So it's always kind of a bleary-eyed group that he brings. But I was just over at Acre yesterday, and that represents to me a brilliant example. This was an old bowling club downtown here that has now been converted, and there is a giant community garden out front. And he's brought this brilliant young chef who worked with Jamie Oliver, who is another mad advocate for using food, but they grow food. It's community. It's all driven by volunteers. They have 1 or 2 staff that are gardeners, you know, professional gardeners, but it's mostly volunteers, but a certain percentage of the food grown there is actually used in the restaurant. So when customers come in, they're seeing a new face of gaming, a new face of the club, but they're seeing this new sense of sustainability, inclusion, community. So it's a really, I think that's a classic example, along with the beer garden we saw earlier, of the kind of innovation that makes money and builds community.
I think that's good that you mentioned Acre. So that's a great example. Acre is part of the Camperdown Commons, and Dean Thomas is here. That's an organisation or an offshoot of the Canterbury Hurlston Park RSL, which goes to show you can take, you know, vacant land or unused space and recreate it and use the club licence to do that. And so, you know, that's a classic example, and we're very pleased to take you there, Robert, where, in fact, we had the Channel 7 news crew, Darren from Clubs New South Wales, organised that. Channel 7 didn't need to be asked twice. They came out, and if you saw the news last night, Robert Egger was on that. We'll send the clips around on Monday, and then there's articles on what you're doing in the telly today, I believe, as well. So you deserve that recognition, because what you're doing is world class and leading in a really important space. So, ladies and gentlemen, if there aren't were there any final questions? One more. Sorry, yes.
I actually came in a little bit late, and you may have already answered the question, but the obvious thing to me is how do you handle insurance issues? For example, a club handing on leftover food to another entity.
Well, not unlike the US, in Australia, there's what's called the Good Samaritan law that I think is probably very similar language that says, in effect, if it's not given with malicious intent or gross negligence, no group will be held liable. And I could be corrected, but I'm very sure that's very similar language. But we have worked within a school system where we are taking food that would, like a university's dining hall. We take food that's from there. Students oftentimes grow their own food, or it's food donated by great groups like Oz Harvest. And again, I cannot say enough about Ronnie and the work of Oz Harvest. Nothing's worse than somebody who comes in from another place and doesn't acknowledge people who've been on the ground for decades doing powerful work. And for those of you who are interested, she'll be joining me tonight at the awards ceremony. But insurance really is the least of your worries. I think there isn't anybody in our industry that isn't focused, as you are, on the safety and the quality of your food. One person gets sick, whether it's a club or a social enterprise, it's not good for business. So we focus very much on safety and making sure that we never have to use that insurance. But on that note, I'm going to bid away. Thank you again to the chairman, to Anne, to everyone here. Thank you very much. You have treated my wife and I like family, and we are eternally grateful for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.